We'll spend a lot of the early part of this offseason talking about who the Orioles could add to make the team better heading into 2024. But first, we really do need to assess who they have now. So let's rank every player on the Orioles' current 40-man roster coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, October 17th, 2023, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we're doing an Orioles power ranking, taking a look at all 37 players who are going to be on the Orioles 40-man roster on the first day of the offseason. Now, this won't include their 5 impending free agents, but everybody else, we're going to rank them from number 37 down to number 1 with a whole bunch of different tiers they fit into. And the ranking will not just be the best player, but essentially who will make the biggest impact in the future for the Orioles. Somewhat in 2024, but also beyond as well. And that's how we rank them 1 through 37. But that's all coming up on today's episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. Before we get there, though, just want to thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first podcast listen of the day. We're free and available on all podcast listening platforms. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating and a review, whether you listen on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you for all the reviews that have come in. And hey, if you're on YouTube, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. I know I've promised a giveaway after we reach 5,000 subscribers, and thank you all so much for doing so. Later this week, the giveaway will be announced. To enter the giveaway, the first step, as always, you have to be subscribed to Locked On Orioles on YouTube. So make sure you go and do that this week for that Orioles giveaway. But let's jump into it today because, as I said at the top, we're going to do a lot this offseason. We're certainly going to look back at every Orioles player and kind of grade out their 2023 season, but we're also going to look forward because this seems to be the time for the O's that won 101 games and won the AL East but did not win a postseason game to go and add to this team this offseason. And I don't think, that John Angelos is going to spend a whole lot of money. I think he's been very clear on that so far, unfortunately, but they need to get better this offseason. They need to get better every offseason, but now would be the time. But you can't really assess, what the Orioles really need before you assess what is on the roster currently. And I thought this would be an interesting way to do this. The Orioles at the moment have currently 39 players on their 40-man roster. That includes 3 players also on the 60-day injured list, and that includes 5 impending free agents. So we're going to take out the impending free agents because as soon as the postseason ends, they're going to be off that 40-man roster for now. Kyle Gibson, Aaron Hicks is on that list. Adam Frazier is on that list as well for the Orioles, as we'll basically take out those 3, plus, of course, Jack Flaherty and Shintaro Fujinami, and then take a look at the 37 remaining players on the 40-man roster. Ranking them 37 to 1. This isn't necessarily who's just the best player. It's hard to rank hitters against pitchers in that sense as well, but just who brings the most future value to the Orioles and future impact. And a lot of it will have to do with 2024, but as you'll see with some of the other guys I talk about, it'll be 2025 and beyond as well. And these are going to be in all kind of different tiers. So let's start with number 37. The only guy on this list who is in a tier of his own, and that is the we truly don't know yet tier. And that is Seth Johnson. Johnson, the right-handed pitching prospect who was one of the 2 pitchers acquired in the Trey Mancini trade, the 3-way deal with the Rays and the Astros last year at the deadline. Johnson came over from the Rays where he'd had a great time in the minors at high A, and then he was getting Tommy John surgery, but the Orioles were okay with that. They traded for him, and a week after the deadline, he got that Tommy John surgery. Johnson, who came back right at the end of last year in the minor league season, threw 10 1/3 innings, didn't get a great look at him, but he's going to be in Double-A Bowie when the 2024 season starts. But because he was Rule 5 draft eligible last offseason, the Orioles had to add him to the 40-man roster. So he spent an entire year on the 40-man where he was ineligible to pitch, basically, because he was out with the injury. He'll be eligible to pitch for the O's at some point in 2024, but I don't even think they're going to expedite the timeline, even though he is on the 40-man. He is a really good pitching prospect. He was one of the Rays' top 10 prospects when the O's acquired him. but you just don't know at this point. So that's why he's at number 37, and I really don't think he'll make an impact in 2024 either. Number 36 on the list. This starts the category of the DFA or non-tender candidates, at least early in the offseason. Number 36 is Keegan Aiken. It feels like we're pretty much done with Keegan Aiken at this point, right? He was out since June 30th with a lower back injury. When he did pitch this year, 23 2/3 innings and a 6.85 ERA. The Orioles have certainly moved past him. I get that he throws a lot of strikes, had a really good first half in 2022. It hasn't been good since then. I think the O's move on this offseason. Number 35 is another lefty in this tier. That is Bruce Zimmerman. Only saw him for 13 1/3 innings in the big leagues this year to a 4.73 ERA. He was pretty good in AAA Norfolk as basically their main starting pitcher throughout the year. But you could tell with the amount the Orioles were churning through arms this season, especially with a guy like Zimmerman who had options, and they really didn't go to Bruce too many times after he was arguably the Orioles' best starting pitcher for like the first 2 months of 2022. I don't know if they'll immediately DFA him, like he'll be the first candidate, but it's a guy who it could happen to, unfortunately, this offseason. Too many guys have leapt over him in really the power rankings of Orioles starting pitching prospects. Number 34 is Terrin Vavra, also in this DFA non-tender candidates tier. We were excited about him at the end of 2022, but 2023, 56 plate appearances, a 560 OPS, hits for no power, and then was basically out since June with a shoulder injury, tried to come back, re-aggravated it, and went on the IL and kind of ended his season, I believe, sometime in August there. I just don't know with Terrin Vavra. I think he could still have a future in Major League Baseball, but he's just so limited. And I've said this about Vavra a million times. Vavra is a player kind of in the mold of Luis Arraez, right? Who was chasing 400 with the Marlins this year, came up well short, but a shorter guy with basically no power who just kind of hits singles and does a solid job of that, has good zone control. But for that kind of player, and a player who's limited defensively, Arraez is, and Vavra is as well, although he is versatile and can play the infield and the outfield. When you are that kind of player, you have to be a generationally elite hitter and elite with handling the bat. Luis Arraez is that. Terrin Vavra is not that, which makes it tough for him to get on a big league roster. Wouldn't be surprised if the Orioles designate him for assignment this offseason. Joey Crable also on this list. He comes in at number 33 in the DFA non-tender tier. He gave up 1 run in 5 innings with the big league team this year, was mostly in AAA. Actually spent some of the year off the 40-man roster after he was DFA'd, stayed in the org, and then came back up in September. I just think they've kind of moved past Crable, and I think he's a pretty early DFA guy to make space this offseason. And then the last guy in this tier at number 32 is Ryan McKenna. I think McKenna has a really interesting offseason coming up. He is arbitration eligible for the first time this offseason. Now, MLB Trade Rumors says he's only probably going to be due about $750,000 for 2024. That's a very cheap player. But the Orioles have outfielders who are ready, and especially if they want to keep Aaron Hicks around, which I think could happen, there may not be a spot for Ryan McKenna, who is going to run out of options next year, which makes it much tougher to keep him on the roster. You can't just send him down to AAA. 677 OPS in 139 plate appearances for McKenna this year. Spent the year as mostly a defensive replacement. I think there's a good chance he is not an Oriole in 2024. The next tier I am calling the trade bait tier right here. This is just 2 players in it. At number 31, I've got Kyle Stowers. What kind of a bad and lost year it was for Stowers, who in his time at the big league level was only at the beginning of the season when he made the opening day roster, went 2 for 30 with 12 strikeouts, was struggling mightily, was sent back to AAA, and never returned for the Orioles. He had multiple injuries, including some he just couldn't stop, got hit in the face by a pitch and missed some time in AAA Norfolk. The numbers in Norfolk was still good for Stowers, but it was so bad at the big leagues this year, and there are so many outfielders passing him, like especially if you bring back Hicks, but even if you don't, you got Kowser, you got Kjerstad. I mean, he's on a similar footing with McKenna, I feel like, at this point. I don't think Stowers is a DFA candidate, right, because he's still valuable enough where you're not going to do that, and you could just keep him in AAA for depth. But if a team really wanted him and wanted to put him on the big league roster, the O's could certainly include him in a trade. And number 30, also in this tier of trade bait, is Joey Ortiz. We saw a little bit of him in the big leagues this year, 212 average in 34 plate appearances, but he was great again in AAA, an 885 OPS at that level. Did have a couple of injury issues this season, but we know he's still an elite defensive shortstop, can play other infield positions, can hit for a little power, can hit for average. There's just a lot of question marks about how he fits into this infield moving forward. Again, he's not a guy certainly who's going to be left off the roster in any kind of DFA sense, but he could find himself as more AAA depth, and he could find himself in a trade if the O's want to upgrade the Major League roster this offseason. The next tier involves 3 players. These guys are the up-down relievers, and coming in at number 29 is Nick Vespi, the definition of the up-down guy. The Orioles exhausted all of his 5 options that you can use for a guy in one season, and despite that, he only threw 14 2/3 innings for the Orioles this year with a 4.30 ERA. The stuff is solid. The slider's good. The fastball is deceptive, but it's a fastball that tops out at 90, maybe 91. It's tough to have those guys in the bullpen. Now, it helps him more that he's a lefty and he has kind of a deceptive arm angle. I think Vespi is a guy who might survive this 40-man roster crunch again this offseason, but I think 2024 will be make or break for Nick Vespi. If the O's don't feel like they're really using him much again, I think 24 could be his last season with the Orioles. Number 28 in the up-down reliever tier is Mike Baumann, who, if you would have asked me in the first half of the season, he would have been much higher on this list, but it was not a good finish to the year for Baumann. Ended up throwing 64 2/3 innings for the O's this year in his first season as a full conversion to a reliever, and did post a solid 3.76 ERA, but he got some key outs for the Orioles in the first half. Down the stretch of the season, he was not good at all. A lot of meatballs, a lot of homers, ended up finishing the year in AAA because he was struggling so much. And Brian Baker was selected over him for the playoff roster. It was not a good finish for Baumann. He'll be back in camp next year trying to win a bullpen job, but it's going to be a little tougher for him going into next season. And then I just mentioned him. The other guy in this tier at number 27 is Brian Baker. Basically neck and neck with Mike Baumann, but I put him one spot ahead because Baker was given the playoff spot and Baumann was not. That tells you the organization thinks a little bit higher of Brian Baker still. I know it was a struggle this season. 3.60 ERA, though, in 45 big league innings. He spent some time at AAA, and he had a disastrous playoff appearance in Game 2 of the ALDS. But as you all know, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, I'm still a Brian Baker believer. He's got some of the best stuff in that pen. He just needs to figure out where it's going, and he needs to hone in and get control of that changeup once again. If he does, I certainly think we can see him back to the 2022 version of Brian Baker and helping out the Orioles bullpen next season. The next tier is kind of a mishmash of 3 players, and I called these some of the big question marks this offseason. That's what I named this tier. And at number 26, it is Jorge Mateo. Pretty big question mark for the Orioles this offseason. Mateo, after an incredible April, was just terrible with the bat the rest of the season. Ended up with a 6.07 OPS on the year, but he did steal 32 bases and still did play a good defensive shortstop, and he still hit lefties pretty well. And that is why he stayed on the roster all year, was on the playoff roster as a pinch hitter, but hey, started Game 2 and went 4 for 4 at the plate in that one as well. So he still gives you a little offensive pop. Now, it's not like he's becoming a free agent or anything, but there's going to become an infield crunch for the Orioles this season. If they feel like he's mostly a pinch runner at this point, is there places on him for the roster, especially with Jackson Holliday ready to go in 2024? I'm not so sure. He's going to be due about $3 million in arbitration for 2024. That could factor into this decision with how cheap John Angelos is. Definitely a non-tender candidate, but they've got big questions to answer with Jorge Mateo. Another question to answer is Jacob Webb, who comes in at number 25. Webb, who had a kind of a weird stint with the Orioles. He was claimed off waivers from the Angels in August. First 10 appearances was basically unhittable, was awesome. The next ones after that weren't as good. Finished with a 3.27 ERA in 22 innings with the O's, but it wasn't very good down the stretch. He gave up homers in Game 1 and 2 of the ALDS, including the back-breaking grand slam in Game number 2. He's been good in the past, like with the Braves and even some with the Angels, and had pitched in the postseason before. He's going to be due about $1.2 million in arbitration if the O's want to bring him back for next year. I think he's going to be a really, really interesting guy who's going to be right on the roster bubble all offseason. And then number 24, the final guy in this question marks tier, is Dylan Tate, right? You may have forgotten about Dylan Tate. He did not pitch at all in 2023 after posting a 3.05 ERA in about 74 innings in 2022 as what I would call Brandon Hyde's most trusted reliever, from beginning to end last season. Had a forearm issue in the winter. It just never recovered. It never healed. He pitched in a bunch of rehab games in Double and AAA, but never got back to the big leagues. O's basically shut him down in like July or August, and we really didn't hear a peep about how he was doing since then. I did hear that he was with the team a few times, like was back and forth between Baltimore and back at home and rehabbing, but we never really heard much. It's going to be interesting to see. Someone's got to ask Elias about the status of Dylan Tate this offseason, because the O's would love to have him in the bullpen next year, especially when they'll be missing Felix Bautista, to have a really good, solid middle relief option. But here's the thing. It's an elbow injury. You never know if he might need Tommy John. You never know what he's going to be if he does step back on a mound next season. You never know if he'll be as good as he was last year. That makes him a huge question mark, but he's this high on the list because when we've seen him be good, he is a really good reliever for the Orioles. But a lot of those guys I just mentioned, it wouldn't be surprising if none of those players are on the Orioles opening day roster, right? Like all those guys from Seth Johnson down to Dylan Tate. You wouldn't be super surprised if none of them made the roster next year. The next guys I'll get into, though, these are guys who are going to make some sort of impact for the Orioles, most definitely in 2024. But the question is, how big will that impact be? We'll pick up the list again, starting with number 23, coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Bird Dogs. Now, I've talked about the Bird Dogs a whole lot on this podcast, right? Like, these Bird Dogs are basically the most comfortable pair of shorts that I have ever worn. But here is the thing about the Bird Dogs, right? Like, it's getting a little colder out here in Baltimore, and you're thinking, okay, Connor, you always talk about the shorts, but what about the pants? Well, let's talk about the shorts first. Stretch khaki shorts are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and the leg, and they give you a sculpted look. They really, really do fit well, and they feel good. Best of all, maybe they look good as well. And the Bird Dogs, they're functional for any occasion. It is the perfect pair of shorts. But here's the thing. I've got a pair of the Bird Dogs pants as well. And the pants, well, they might just be just as great. These Bird Dogs pants, they still keep you cool while also keeping you warm. It's really hard to explain it, but if you got too many covers on at night, you're sleeping on the Bird Dogs pants, maybe you're getting a little sweaty. No. The Bird Dogs still have that same technology, the same fabric to keep you just cool enough while also keeping you warm in the winter. So go to birddogs.com/lockedonmlb or enter promo code lockedonmlb at checkout for a free Bird Dogs water bottle with your order. That's birddogs.com/lockedonmlb for a free water bottle at checkout. You won't want to take your Bird Dogs off. We promise you that. So we are power ranking all 37 players on the Orioles 40-man roster here. We've gotten 37 through 24 on the list. Basically, the ranking is around, what their, let's call it, future impact value with the Orioles will be, not just in 2024, but in the years ahead as well. And let's get to number 23, which takes us to the next tier of players. Two guys in this tier, which I called the solid vets. And number 23 is James McCann. Kind of a perfect spot for a backup catcher to be on a 26-man roster is number 23. 226 plate appearances for McCann this year after the Orioles acquired him in a trade with the Mets in the offseason to be just a solid, reliable veteran backup for Adley Rutschman. That's kind of exactly what he was this year for the O's, right? Like, he was solid, he was reliable, he was a good backup. Had a 646 OPS, had his moments with the bat, but he was good defensively, solid framer, really good thrower back there, okay blocker. He just did his job, and he will be Adley's backup again next year. Number 22 on the list, also in the solid vet category, is Cole Irvin. Very much had an up and down first season with the O's after they acquired him in a trade with the A's last offseason. 77 and a third innings, worked both as a starter and a reliever, and had a 4.42 ERA for the O's this season. Disastrous start to the season in the rotation, goes to AAA for a while, comes back as a starter, reliever, and pitched much better after he came back. But those first three starts were a nightmare. I honestly think Cole Irvin will play a bigger role for the Orioles in 2024. I think they'll work out some of the issues he had. I actually think he'll start more games for the Orioles next year, too. I still believe in Irvin, and here's the thing. They still have 3 more years of control of Cole Irvin. That's why they made that deal with the A's, so he's going to be around for a little while longer. Our next tier is also 2 players, and that is the small sample size prospects. Number 21, Colton Cowser. Now, Cowser made it to the big leagues a little earlier than the next guy on this list, but In 72 plate appearances, it wasn't very good. Had just a 434 OPS, despite a 937 OPS in AAA this year where Cowser was killing it. But he came to the big leagues and just wasn't quite ready yet, struggled with the bat, went back down to AAA, and really never returned in a meaningful way to the big leagues. I'm not at all ready to write off Colton Cowser. I think he'll be a good big leaguer, and I think we'll see him back in black and orange in 2024. But there's a chance that it may not even be on the opening day roster because there's so many guys around him, and because the next guy at number 20, Heston Kjerstad, kind of took his roster spot later in the season. Kjerstad, who was called up in September, a 748 OPS in 33 plate appearances, made the postseason roster, did not appear in a playoff game, but it was big that he was there and Cowser was in AAA. These two guys are neck and neck. They do different things, although they are both left-handed hitters. Kjerstad can hit for more power. Cowser can maybe hit for a little more average. Cowser a better defender, but Kjerstad a little more flexibility because he can play first base as well. It's going to be back and forth between these two guys, and that's why they are tiered together, but I expect them both to make an impact for the Orioles next year. Our next tier is the quote-unquote veterans who are peeking over their shoulders a little bit at some prospects. Yeah, a long name for a tier, but it's my podcast. I make up the tiers. Number 19 is Ramon Urias. What an interesting year for Urias, right? He wins the Gold Glove in 2022, comes back out here in 2023, plays not a full season, right? About 400 plate appearances, so he was an in and out of the lineup player. 703 OPS. His defense wasn't as good, but it was still good at third and second base this season. He was just kind of a league average player off the bench, and he's versatile, and he can hit a little bit. Now, his power basically got drained out of his bat, which was an issue this year. I have no read on Ramon Urias and what his future is with the Orioles. If you told me he's going to be a solid utility contributor next year, I'd believe you. If you told me he was on another team next year, I'd believe you. I don't know at this point. He is the guy who could be hurt by this roster crunch in the infield the most. It's really interesting to see. He's going to hit arbitration here, going to be due about $2 million, it looks like. I don't know. It's something I'm looking forward to kind of talking about more this offseason, but he's kind of in the squishy part of the middle of the order. Number 18 on the list is Austin Hayes. Now, this is going to feel kind of low on this list for Austin Hayes, right? 566 plate appearances, hits 275, 769 OPS. He's an all-star this year for the first time, but once again, he was not as good in the second half as he was in the first half. And although he played almost every day, the Orioles did not rely on him as much in the second half of the season. I still think he's back as an Oriole next year, but he hits the ball on the ground too much. He still gets a little injured, still gets banged up, tries to play through it, just not super reliable. Could he be pushed into a platoon with either Cowser or Kjerstad next year in left field? I mean, it could certainly happen. I wouldn't think it would be crazy out of the question, and that to me is why he is down there a little lower, and he's, like Urias is looking over the shoulder at Holiday and Ortiz and guys like that. Hayes is certainly looking over his shoulder at Kjerstad and Cowser. And then at number 17, another guy who you could think that's a little low is Ryan O'Hearn, also in this quote-unquote vets looking over their shoulders role. I know O'Hearn was just a revelation this year. O's brought him in, 370 plate appearances, 802 OPS, hit in the middle of the order most of the year. But even though the O's have certainly tweaked something with him, and certainly he feels more free to be a good hitter in Baltimore, it was kind of 5 bad seasons in Kansas City and then 1 good season in Baltimore. You still don't know if that is going to be sustainable for Ryan O'Hearn, and he is a free agent after 2024. So the O's have him for 1 more year, but then you just kind of don't know after that if they would really re-up him with all these great hitting prospects. So he's looking over his shoulder at guys like Heston Kjerstad and, not as much Colton Cowser, but really at Heston Kjerstad saying, am I going to still be the left-handed hitting first baseman on this team for all of next year if Kjerstad continues to hit and the O's know that I won't be back after 24? The next tier, 2 players. I call these the good bullpen lefties. Number 15, or number 16 on the list, I should say, is Cionel Perez. Perez, who had an amazing 2022, came out here, and it was rough to watch in the first half of 2023. But the O's stuck with him, and he was dynamite down the stretch. At one point late in the year, had 25 consecutive scoreless appearances. Perez with a 3.54 ERA altogether in 53 and a third innings of work this year. And basically, from my perspective, became Brandon Hyde's most trusted reliever once we got to late September and the postseason. I expect him to be in a similar role to start next season. And a very similar thing for Danny Coulomb, who the Orioles got in basically a nothing trade the day before opening day this year, and he turned out to be huge for this ball club. 2.81 ERA in 51 1/3 innings. Now, he is 33 years old, and he's had some struggles in the past and some injuries in the past, so you do not know if you're going to get this from Coulomb again in 2024, but the O's are certainly going to hold on to him and ride that left arm as long as he continues to get guys out. And then the next tier, 4 players, I believe the biggest tier I have on this list, and this tier is starters or relievers. Now, there are guys on the roster, but are they starters or relievers? Number 14 is Tyler Wells. I tend to lean reliever at this point, despite the fact that he's been a good starter the last 2 years, but his body has broken down in the second half each of those 2 seasons. A 3.64 ERA in 119 innings this year. And then he came out there in September and was a lockdown reliever, didn't give up a run, closed out the clinching game, pitched well in his 2 outings in the postseason as well, and he was just really good at it. In fact, he pitched in all 3 games in that ALDS and didn't give up a run. I see him maybe trying it out as a starter again, but ending up in the bullpen next year. Number 13 is Dean Kramer on this starter or reliever list. A 4.12 ERA in about 172 2/3 innings pitched this year, all as a starter for the Orioles. Of course, the last time we saw him, he got rocked as the O's season ended in Game 3 against the Rangers in Texas. But in general, it was a solid season for Kramer. Wasn't as good as he was in 2022. Also, the peripherals looked a little shaky, gave up a lot of homers, a lot of hard contact, but he still got plenty of guys out to stay in the rotation all year. I think he has an inside track to a rotation spot for next year, but if the Orioles do bring in a couple of outside starting pitchers, Kramer could certainly be moved into the bullpen. Number 12 on the list in the starters or relievers tier, D.L. Hall. Now, we didn't see a lot of him this year because of the deloading process and the back injury and the weightlifting and whatever it was. It was 19 1/3 innings and a 3.26 ERA at the big league level. But late in the year and in the postseason, Brandon Hyde leaned on D.L. Hall as a reliever, and he was awesome, especially in the playoffs. He was probably the O's best pitcher in that ALDS. Now, the Orioles have said they're going to give him a chance to start in spring training next year. I would give him that same chance, but I think at the end of the day, we'll probably see him as a reliever, and he'll be striking out hitters left and right. And then number 11, final guy in this tier, is John Means. 4 starts coming back from Tommy John in September, 23 2/3 innings, and a 2.66 ERA. Not a lot of strikeouts, but basically no walks. There were a lot of strikes per usual for Means, but the elbow was bothering him a bit before the postseason, and that was enough for the O's to leave him off the ALDS roster because he wasn't healthy, and that certainly was a blow to the Orioles pitching staff as they were swept by the Rangers. But for Means, he's more in the starter category heading into the next year, but it's more of the question of, is he healthy? Is he going to hold up heading into next season? But that leaves us with the top 10 on this list. And I think you know who most of these guys are. These are the impact players for the Orioles. But where do I rank them? 10 to 1? That's coming up next to finish off the pod. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. Now, this is a pretty good time for sports, right? And it's a pretty good time to be on FanDuel because October baseball is back, and you can make your postseason debut with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Join FanDuel today, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to create your new account. Then you can get in on the action from the first pitch until the final out. And you can bet on everything from strikeouts to homers to who will win the game. And if you don't want to wait the whole game to get a W, predict what will happen in the next at-bat with quick bets. So head on over to FanDuel.com/lockedon right now. Step up to the plate this postseason with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. So we're counting down the Orioles on the 40-man roster, 37 to 1. Kind of ranking them by their future impact for 2024 and beyond with the O's. Just got through 37 through 11. Now it's time for the top 10. And our next tier is 2 players. I call these guys producing in their mid-20s, but not quite stars. Number 10 is Jordan Westburg. I know Westburg, a 715 OPS and a 260 average in his 228 plate appearances with the Orioles this year, was good, but not amazing. But I see big things in the future for Jordan Westburg. Now, I'm not sure if he's going to be any kind of perennial all-star player. but he's going to be a guy who just gets up there every day and produces. He's versatile. He can play 3 spots in the infield. He can play a little bit of the outfield if you need him to, and he just hits. He's got a good approach. I'm impressed by Jordan Westburg every time he goes out there, and we're going to see a lot of him next season. Number 9 on the list in this same tier is Ryan Mountcastle. 470 plate appearances this year, 270 average, and a 780 OPS for the Orioles. What a weird season it was for Mountcastle, who started off red hot, had that 9 RBI game in April, then slumped badly, then went on the injured list for what turned out to be a long spell of vertigo. Then when he finally came back basically at the All-Star break, he was on fire for the remainder of the season, was one of the more productive hitters in the postseason as well, and basically looked like he was turning into a bench bat, claimed his spot back as an everyday starter for the O's. The question is, can he continue that hot streak? Can he continue to hit at that level? I tend to think yes. I think the vertigo was a huge issue for why he struggled at times this year, and I think we're going to see a lot from Ryan Mountcastle next season. Next tier, I call the relief aces. There's 2 guys in there, you know who they are. Number 8 on the list is Yennier Cano. What a breakout season for Cano, who came out of nowhere this year to make the All-Star team, post a 2.11 ERA in 72 2/3 innings, become the dominant setup man, and become the Orioles closer at times when Felix Bautista went out late in the year. Now, I don't expect Cano to be this good next year. It is hard to count on a reliever who relies on ground balls more than strikeouts, but he's going to be good again, and the O's are going to go to him again. I don't think they should make him the closer next year without Bautista. I think they should give that role to someone else, but he's going to be a really good setup guy. And speaking of Felix Bautista, he is number 7 on this list. Now, I get he should take a hit because he's getting Tommy John surgery. He's missing all of 2024. He should be back in 2025, but we don't know what he's going to be at that point after Tommy John surgery. But Bautista was the best reliever in baseball this year. 1.48 ERA in 61 innings before he went down with the elbow injury, the UCL tear on August 25th. He was incredible down the stretch in 2022 as well. He's just so good that I know he could take a step back after Tommy John, but even a step back for Bautista is still the Orioles' best reliever and is still a super valuable player on this team. The next tier I call the hitters you lean on. And whether they do it or not is a different question, but these are the older hitters that you lean on. Number 6 is Cedric Mullins. Now, this might feel a little high for Mullins, who ended up with all his struggles late in the year being just a league average hitter this season. 455 plate appearances. He hit just 233 with a 721 OPS on the year, and he was awful down the stretch, including the postseason. Mullins finished the year 2 for his last 48, was just a disaster in September and in October. But Mullins also took some of the biggest swings of the year with the Orioles, and you have to think he was fighting through an injury down the stretch. The awful stretch he had in August and September when he hit under 200 in August, September, and October in the postseason, that was all after he returned from that second groin injury. And just watching him play and looking at the bad at-bats, you have to think he was not 100%. He was still bothered by the groin. Hopefully he takes this offseason to get healthy and goes back to that productive Orioles center fielder that we know and love. And number 5 on this list, also in the hitters you lean on tier, is Anthony Santander. Another great year for Santander. 650 plate appearances, was basically in there every day for the O's. He stayed healthy, hit 257, 797 OPS, 28 bombs for the Orioles switch hitter, one of the best switch hitters in baseball right now. He's got one more year on the contract. He's a free agent after 2024. There's murmurs the O's could trade him this offseason because he's getting more expensive, going to be due probably more than $12 million in arbitration next season. Hold on to him. Keep him in the middle of the order. The O's need that power switch hitting bat. The next tier, 2 guys in it. They are the budding aces. You know who they are. Number 4 is Grayson Rodriguez, a 4.35 ERA and 122 innings for Grayson, but it was really a tale of 2 seasons. Those first handful of starts at the beginning of the year, he was bad. He goes to AAA. He comes back. He's got a sub-2.5 ERA down the stretch for the Orioles, was dynamite. Yes, the first postseason start did not go well in Game 2 of the ALDS against the Rangers, but otherwise, I trust Grayson Rodriguez is morphing into the pitching prospect we knew he could be when he was coming through the Orioles system, and he would be the ace of this staff, if not for number 3 on the list, in Kyle Bradish. This is kind of my victory lap on Kyle Bradish, right? I've called it and called it and called it. He's going to be the ace of this Orioles staff. What does he do this year? Become the ace of this Orioles staff. Get Game 1 of the postseason, and unless the O's bring in a big name this offseason, should start opening day next year. Bradish, 168 2/3 innings, a 2.83 ERA this season. He's going to get some down-ballot votes for AL Cy Young. Was just incredible in every way. Cannot wait to watch him pitch for years to come. Then the final tier, the final two players, I call them the young stars and maybe the young superstars. Number 2 on this list is Adley Rutschman. Just another really good year from Rutschman in his first full season in the big leagues. Almost 700 plate appearances. He was in there basically as much as possible. Hit .277 and .809 OPS. Good switch hitter, good defensively, good leader for this team. Wherever he hit in the lineup, he was just really, really solid. Yeah, some of his defensive numbers took a little bit of a step down, and maybe he didn't have the power we were asking for this year, but he's only in his first full big league season. He's going to get better, and he was really good this year. And then number 1 on the list, the guy who really broke out this year, was Gunnar Henderson. He's going to win AL Rookie of the Year. He was outstanding this year, despite an abysmal start. He was hitting 170 after 6 weeks this season, but the O's stuck with him, ended up hitting .255, .814 OPS, went 6 for 12 in the postseason, was the Orioles' best hitter, full stop by the end of the season. Just an incredibly dangerous bat, whether he's hitting first, second, third, fourth, fifth, wherever he's been in the lineup. Teams fear him. He did struggle against lefties a little bit, but the defense got really good this year. Hitting against lefties seems to be the final flaw of him. And guess what? He's 22 years old. He's got a little bit of time to figure that out. I'm sure he will focus on that this offseason. He'll probably come out there even better and gunning for an AL MVP award, and you would think his first All-Star appearance in 2024. But there's the rankings. 37 down to 1 of the most impactful players for the future of the Orioles that are currently on this 40-man roster. But let me know in the YouTube comments, how did I do? How would your rankings change? How would your top 10 specifically change from mine? Tell me why I'm right, or more so, like what most of you like to do, tell me why I'm wrong in the YouTube comments. But that'll do it for today's episode. Tomorrow we're back, and we will start kind of looking back at these individual players' seasons, talking about 2023 for each of these guys, how they impacted the Orioles, grading out their seasons, then talking about what impact they'll make going into 2024. That process starts on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.